This is the Comics Alternative, episode 254, Halloween Comics 2017. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics.
That's right. And this week's episode is our annual Halloween special, which means that today Paul and I are going to be discussing a variety of 2017 Halloween comics and also very timely horror titles. But before we get to that, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts will be anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover, but every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right. And one of the ways that you can find those discounts is to head over to DCBS and check out their specials. Now, those of you who regularly order from DCBS will know that there's this kind of a little thrill that comes at the beginning of the month. You know, you get in your paycheck, you're starting to think, why am I so excited about it being the third of the month? Well, the reason might be that you're finding the new month's listings for pre-orders up at DCBS, and you'll find specials in those bundles at up to 50% off, and they always have DC bundles of all kinds, Marvel bundles, Valiant bundles, a variety of titles, and also other specials from publishers like IDW and Dark Horse. And that wide range of publishers is actually the range of publishers that we're going to be looking at with the Halloween comics that we look at today. But that same wide range of stuff that you are probably interested in, you will find at Discount Comic Book Service, including many bundles on sets of their books. So check those out. Great way to take advantage of the awesome discounts that you can find at dcbservice.com.
That's right. That's dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right. Tell them we sent you.
Well, Paul, this is a fun time of the year for us on the Comics Alternative. I like horror comics normally, but I also appreciate seasonal Halloween titles. And so this gives us the opportunity to talk briefly about many titles that have come out, let's say in the past 2 or 3 weeks, or will come out, if not this week, then next week, right before Halloween.
Yeah, I'm really excited to join you for this conversation. Derek, I want to ask you a question. If there are a few all-time favorite horror titles that you like, because here's the thing. I didn't tell you this before you invited me onto this episode, Derek, but I'm actually not normally a huge fan of horror comics in general or Halloween comics in specific, but I had a lot of fun with these titles. And we'll talk about it. And though it's not normally my genre of choice or genres of choice, I actually am fascinated by our interest in horror titles. So I do have some all-time favorite horror comics and series, things like Rachel Rising and things like Lock and Key that I especially love. But I don't know. Do you have? I mean, just maybe for a taste of a framework for that we can think about these horror comics, these Halloween comics. Do you have a few all-time favorites off the top of your head?
Not really that I guess that stand out outside of something like The Walking Dead, which is interesting in that as we record this, which is on Sunday, October 22nd, the next season of The Walking Dead begins tonight. So as soon as we finish recording, I'm going to make dinner and then get ready for the season premiere of Walking Dead. But I do enjoy the Walking Dead comic. I guess it is a standout for me.
Now, that's a contemporary example, but also I'm an extremely big fan of the old EC comics. And in fact, over the past several years, I've been collecting the various volumes of the EC archives that first Gemstone and GC and then now Dark Horse has been putting out. I've also been getting the black and white EC collections from Fantagraphics, and those are artist-centric. So I very much love the old EC horror titles.
Yes.
But one of the things about horror comics that stands out even more is when I was young and reading comics in the 1970s, before you were born, I didn't gravitate toward the superhero genre. It was horror that I primarily read. Horror and comedy. I read a lot of Harvey. I loved Sad Sack and Hot Stuff. But in terms of, let's say, DC Comics or DC Marvel, I never was a big Marvel person growing up. But of the DC, I would read House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Ghost, Weird War Tales. Right. Those are the titles that I would gobble up. So yeah, I have going back to my days of youth and reading comics, a long history in terms of horror.
Yeah.
And this seasonal Halloween / horror episode we've been doing for the past several years. I think for the first 2 or 3 years I did it with Gene. Last year I think it was the first time that Andy Kunka joined me on that show. And now you're doing this, ironically not being a big fan of horror, but I'm glad that you enjoyed the titles that we're going to be looking at. Now, last year, I went back right before we started to record this. I looked at what we discussed last year, and we discussed quite a number, Andy and I, quite a number of horror titles. For instance, The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror, number 22, SpongeBob Comics, number 61, Adventure Time Spooktacular 2016, Disney's Giant Halloween Hex, Betty Boop number 1, Spell on Wheels number 1, Lost Boys number 1, American Vampire Anthology number 2, The Double Life of Miranda Turner, and then Nick's Comics Quarterly number 9. So as you could tell from that lineup, some are specific to that year's Halloween, like Simpsons Treehouse of Horror and Adventure Time Spooktacular, but then others came out right before or in the Halloween or the month of October, like Betty Boop number 1 or Spell on Wheels and Lost Boys. Even though they're not specifically Halloween related, they do deal with horror in one form or another. They're coming out in October. The timing may or may not have been to coincide with Halloween, but we looked at them because they deal with horror in the month of October. Right. Now, of all those titles I just listed that Andy and I discussed last year, there's actually only one repeat that we're looking at this year, and that is Adventure Time Spooktacular. Not that we didn't want to look at, let's say, The Simpsons Treehouse of Horror. I couldn't get my hands on this year's Treehouse of Horror. I guess I should have made a better effort, but we've got plenty to discuss.
Oh, we got a lineup.
That's right. And just real quick, what we're going to be looking at, and then we'll get into more details in a minute. Paul and I are going to be discussing from Humanoids, Halloween Tales Volume 1, Adventure Time Spooktacular 2017 from KaBoom, Mr. Higgins Comes Home from Dark Horse, and then another Dark Horse title, Sherlock, Frankenstein, and the Legion of Evil number 1, and then a couple of Archies, Jughead, The Hunger, and number 1, and then Archie Halloween Spectacular. And then a DC title, DC House of Horror, which is an interesting one. And then a couple of books from IDW, Spooky, The Strange Tales, Monster Inn, and then Behind You. And then we're going to wrap up by talking briefly about a book from Super Genius, and I hadn't heard of that publisher before, High Moon, Bullet Holes, and Bite Marks. And so
There's a lot for us to discuss, Paul.
A lot to talk about, and fun to do this because, I think it'll be cool to kind of compare one thing to another. We've been saying horror. Some of these are more or less spooky, more or less targeted towards kids who might be trick-or-treating or adults who probably have no business trick-or-treating. But, a little taste for all different ages, all kinds of audiences. So it'll be fun to go through.
That's right. One other thing, though, we should mention before we get started is that the incidental music that you hear on this year's Halloween episode, in other words, the music between the various segments, has been provided to us by Casanova Frankenstein. He is a comics creator that we have mentioned several times on the Comics Alternative. And thank you, Casanova. We hope you listeners enjoy the music. Well, Paul, let's begin with this first title that we had mentioned, and this is Halloween Tales Volume 1, and this is by, and let me see if I can pronounce this name correctly, Olivier Boiscommun&nbsp, and this is coming out from Humanoids. It was actually released mid-September, and this is part of a 3-volume series that was released in September. And it is part of the Humanoids Kids imprint. I've mentioned on the show before that Humanoids over the past several months is making more of a concerted effort to put out things for younger readers or all-age titles. And this is something that I had learned back in the late spring when I talked with one of the publicists at Humanoids, Joe Witherington, and he was telling me, we're going to be coming out with some kids' titles in the near future, so you may want to keep your eyes open for that. And so this is one of those titles. Now, we don't have all 3 volumes of Halloween Tales. We have just the first. But this does, I think, give a pretty good sense of what this series is. And I'm curious. I mean, it's not a very long book at all. It's a relatively short narrative. What did you think of the first volume of Halloween Tales?
Yeah, you're right. As far as length, it's definitely that European album length, that size and length. That's about 50-odd pages. It was interesting. I always expect that when I read a work of, and I believe this was originally in French, we might say translated by Montana Kane. Whenever I read a work of French comics and BD, without the guidance of you and Edward in our Eurocomics episode, which people should definitely check out if they haven't heard, I always wonder if something will be lost in translation for me, just because I'm not as steeped in that stuff. I mean, I've read some BD, but I was not surprised then that some of the things that felt a little bit, it took some getting used to for me, turned out to be the case in this one. Because when I looked at the cover, there are a bunch of kids who are in Halloween costumes. They might be out trick-or-treating. That was the kind of story that I expected. And, I don't know that the art style, which it's quite beautifully rendered, but it's a very oil painty sort of look. And what I wasn't sure what that signaled to me as a reader. Was this something that that would be sort of be light and, in a good way, kind of frivolous, Halloween fun, or would it be darker and more serious and maybe, upsettingly creepy? Was this something that I would read with my kid, or probably read without my kid because she's, like me, pretty scared of scary things? And what it wound up becoming was a very short bit of little kids trick-or-treating and a very long bit of one of those characters encountering without wanting to give too much away at this point, a sort of ghostly companion, and having a fairly long meditation, really, about her own thoughts and life and all kinds of things. And we can get into what she's contemplating a little bit more later. So that was a total surprise for me. And so I have to admit that, part of me thought, okay, there's something probably really French about this that I don't know what categories to put it in. And then part of it was just so surprised that this wasn't what I anticipated going in, that it took me a while just to even process what was going on. And by the end of it, to wonder a lot, who is this for? What age audience is it for? And what is this work doing? And so, as I like starting with this title, because as we'll get into with a lot of the other ones, there's some pretty clear, okay, this is what this comic is trying to do for me with the other titles that we're going to read. With this one, it was the most sort of mysterious in terms of what it was kind of trying to accomplish, or how it was using some blend of horror genre and other genres to do that. So I don't know. Right. I'm really curious what you thought about it.
Yeah, you mentioned the art. I have to say I really do enjoy the art. And this volume number 1, and the title of this story is Halloween. I think volume 2, the title is The Story of Joe, and then volume 3 is The Book of Jack. Now, this volume, both the story and the art are by Olivier Boiscommun. And again, I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly. I said, though, at the outset that another creator of these Halloween tales is D.P. Filippi, or Denis Pierre Filippi.
Right.
But if you look at the credits page of Volume 1, Filippi's name is nowhere on this. And so my guess is that Filippi does some work with the second and or the third volume. And so the series is credited to both of them.
I see.
But Boiscommun does the art and the story of this one that we have that we're discussing. I'm with you in that it did take an interesting turn. This story starts off with a group of kids trick-or-treating, and there's one in their group that kind of hangs back. Her name is Asphodel. I guess that's how you pronounce her name.
Your guess is as good as mine. Better, I'm sure.
And they're trying to get her to come out and have fun with the rest of them. And she's hanging back. And, one of them says, come on out, it's Halloween. And this character, Asphodel, says, I'm not in the mood for fun. I want to go home. And then she says, bye. Then one of the kids says to the other, is your friend always like that? And the companion says, don't worry about it. She's just a little sad. She misses her brother. Now, that's all we know about this young girl, Asphodel, and her brother. She misses her brother. Where is her brother? Is her brother in another location? Did he move away from home? Is he dead?
Right.
What? We don't know. And I think that sets up in an interesting way what happens next, because as Asphodel goes home, she is confronted by this, and I can't remember how you put it, but it's kind of a strange presence. I don't know if I'd call it a spirit. It could be, for all we know. It seems ghost-like or spirit-like. That's made up to look almost like a clown or a harlequin, something like the Joker in a way, in terms of the makeup on the face. And we don't know who this figure is, but I think before we see this figure, 2 pages before, I think it's 2 pages before, there's this reference to she misses her brother. Now, might this have to be to do with the brother? We don't know. It's never explained. And that's good, I think, because it does create that sense of mystery.
Yes.
And then this kind of ghostly or spirit presence, whatever it is, as he, I guess it's a he, talks to Asphodel, more times than not, there's rhyme. And this spirit figure is trying to, so to speak, buck her up and to help her feel better about herself and her situation. And so what starts off as something potentially a little depressing and even spooky turns out at the end to be rather life-affirming.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And just before this Harlequin apparition appears, she does want to contemplate death. She's in fact talking about whether or not you celebrate death. She says, you don't celebrate death. Death is cold and empty and sad, trailing off to the next panel, and it leaves you all alone. And that's when this companion appears. And so it's a confrontation, what she's thinking about and what the conversation with the ongoing conversation with this ghost or whatever it is about, is really that question about being by yourself and how one thinks about death. And so that's super interesting. Again, that's where I was like, wow, this is not what I was expecting. Mm-hmm. But you're right. I mean, ultimately life affirming. And so pretty affecting to read it, and to really think about it. Just had caught me by surprise, which is a good thing, for a comic to do. Yeah. Yeah.
And, this encounter between Asphodel and this Harlequin spirit figure, whatever the hell it is, it's not only life-affirming in terms of the way that Asphodel sees her own life and her own attitudes towards death. Mm-hmm. I think that this Harlequin spirit's message is also one of tolerance and acceptance and treating others well, because there's actually there are a couple of occasions where Asphodel encounters this other kid, and this is not a spirit, but this is a trick-or-treater, someone I guess about her own age, maybe a little older, who is wearing a pumpkin on his head,
a jack-o'-lantern.
A jack-o'-lantern, yeah, and you can tell that he is not the most pleasant of individuals, but she doesn't really hate him or say nasty things about him, because this Harlequin figure seems to be telling her that, accept people for what they are. We're not on this earth for very long. Get along, yada, yada. In other words, a positive message.
Yeah.
That goes along with, getting along with others, which goes hand in hand with the life-affirming attitudes that we get in this book. Yeah. So I thought it was a pretty good title. I mean, this is definitely, I think, for a younger reader. It's something that a younger reader could appreciate. One thing, though, that me as an older reader, it's not that I got tired of it or I thought it was too long, but this spirit figure and his rhyming and his message seemed to go on for quite a long time.
Right.
And I was wondering how... Right. And how much longer is this going to go on? I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing, and it may say more to my impatience in terms of reading than anything. But you're right; it does take up the bulk of the text.
Yeah, I mean, I do think another reason this is a good book to start on is I think we all approach Halloween differently. I mean, there's like a few different ways that people think about Halloween. Is it a night for revelry and dressing up and a little bit of kind of indulging the flesh and, almost Mardi Gras like, or is it a kind of somber, I mean, nobody does a somber contemplation of death, but do we want to be scared? Like, do we want to have our socks scared off of us because we need to get inside of something psychologically, or for some of us, it's just, sort of I don't like it and I'm avoiding it because I don't like any of that stuff. And so in some ways, I think it represents a variety of ways in which we contemplate death or darkness. Mm-hmm. And those various approaches are represented by the two main people in this bulky dialogue, and then even by the kids who appear at the end and the kids who appear at the beginning and the kid who appears at the end, as you said. And significantly, and this is reflected in the art, you start at night and you wind up at dawn, and so it's sort of like we all go through this dark night of whatever approach we brought to it, and come out the other side, and hopefully come out the other side having exorcised some demons or processed some pain or whatever it is that we need to do.
And it ends with candy.
And that's the key.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. The kids, at dawn, Asphodel's friends find her again and they say, "Hey, want to hang out with us? We scored tons of candy." In fact, candy's the very last word of this text. So, yeah, I thought this was an interesting book, and it has me curious about the other two volumes, the Book of Jack and the story of Joe. And Joe there is one of the Asphodel's
friends who's trick-or-treating is referred to as Joe, and I'm wondering if that's the same Joe as Volume 2, The Story of Joe, if it's dealing with this same group of kids in one form or another.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I think that's a nice, interesting setup. One last thing I remembered as I was reading it is that much of the scene that takes place in a very European-looking sort of city, with buildings maybe 500, 700 years old, as she walks up and down these long winding steps and really sort of like the top of a church building or something like that. And I was very reminded of one of the experiences that I had in those few times a while back. I spent time in Europe, which is just to walk on stone streets that are far longer than the 250-year history of the United States, and how different it is, how you can walk these streets that are so old, and there's even a sense of them being, ghostly in terms of how long they've lasted. And that creates a certain effect in this. I think that has a role to play in this visual storytelling that I didn't take for granted, because rare to find that kind of a place anywhere in the U.S. So, yeah.
Right. Okay, let's move on to the next title that we're going to be discussing, and this is Adventure Time Spooktacular 2017. And this is by a variety of different artists and writers. But we should mention that Adventure Time was created by Pendleton Ward, and we have in this year's volume 4 different stories: The Morning Ritual, War of the Magicians, Gumballs Masquerade, and Candy in the House. And by the way, I.N.J. Colbert did the cover, and so that's pretty darn cool.
Yeah.
And also Jordan Crane does the variant cover, which is equally cool. Now, are you a fan, or are you very familiar with Adventure Time, either the comic or the cartoon on Cartoon Network?
Yeah, so I have read a lot of Adventure Time with my daughter, actually.
Good.
Yeah, and she's pretty into it, although she often has to give me the primer. She's read a lot more than I have, so I had to consult her about Pep Butt and remind me who Jake is and so on throughout reading this. But we read it together, so that was a lot of fun. But I've never actually seen the show. We don't actually own a television, so
really,
no
television at all.
Shows. No, we do watch things online, but not much.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, at least you watch it online. So I want to accuse you of being a Luddite.
Sure. A slight Luddite.
Yeah, or let's say a media snob.
That's right.
Yeah, I haven't in quite a while, but every now and again I would watch Adventure Time episodes on Netflix, and it's a cool show. They're relatively short, just kind of in and out. I would watch them maybe as I was eating lunch or something.
Right.
But we have discussed some Adventure Time comics on the Comics Alternative. It's been like 2 or 3 years, maybe more than that. But we have looked at Adventure Time comics in the past, and like I said earlier, last year we did look at an Adventure Time Spooktacular for 2016. Now we got the one for this year, and we have these 4 stories. And one of the reasons why I ask if you're familiar with Adventure Time, people who aren't may be at a loss. Let's say, who is this Pep figure, and what is, Princess Gumballs, and Butterscotch, her butler. But you're familiar enough to where you can jump on and understand what was going on. Now, I have to say, I'm familiar with Princess Gumballs and Finn
Princess
and Jake.
Bubblegum, I think, is it?
Is it Bubblegum or Gumballs? Because it's Gumballs Masquerade.
I think you're right, but I do think it's Princess Bubblegum. I should consult the expert, but
I think Princess Bubblegum is another character.
Oh,
maybe.
okay.
I think it's the one who's kind of a big blob.
Oh, okay.
Who has a unique voice.
Yeah,
at least
okay.
in the card. Maybe I'm wrong. You know,
I
those
deferred
who are listening to this, who are big fans of Adventure Time, may be yelling at their podcatcher right now. It's like, Derek, don't you understand?
No, probably at Paul. But write us in. Let us know.
Yeah,
straight.
You know how off base we are. You know, I am familiar with Finn and Jake, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Pep, not as much. And so I think this first story, The Morning Ritual, which features Pep as, what do they call him, the Dark One?
Yes.
Was really interesting because there is something hellacious about this character, but I don't remember seeing him much, if at all,
right.
on the cartoons.
Right.
But again, I haven't seen that many, just a few.
Yeah.
But I thought that was pretty good. Finn and Jake, the one that they star in, War of the Magicians, that was cute. Gumball's Masquerade was okay. And then the last one, which is another Pep story, Candy in the House, was pretty good as well. I thought that as far as Halloween comics specific to a particular year and a particular Halloween go, this wasn't bad. And if you're an Adventure Time fan, you'll probably like it even more.
Yes.
It's fun.
Yeah.
It's kind of like picking up an Adventure Time KaBoom title on Free Comic Book Day. You know, I don't usually read Adventure Time, but once in a blue moon on special occasions, I look at it, and it's fun enough.
Yeah, I agree. We had a good time reading it. Some of it was weird.
Did you read it with your daughter?
I did. I read it with my daughter. Yeah.
Cool.
And I always feel about Adventure Time, particularly with the Spooktacular now. And is this only the second year that they've done a Spooktacular? Or
no, I don't know how many years.
Okay.
I think they've had it going for a while, but then again, maybe I'm off base.
It's interesting because if it does become an annual thing, it's interesting to compare it to Treehouse of Horror, and I don't know if they do this on the TV show or whatever, but Treehouse of Horror for a long time was, for me, a super interesting place. And we're talking now about The Simpsons, of course, because The Simpsons had such a large cultural presence. And I always think of The Simpsons as a way in which a large segment of the American culture was reconciling with how the world is changing, as a lot of popular entertainment does. And Treehouse of Horror was a really fun kind of, I always think of it, drawing from literary theory, as a kind of carnivalesque, anything goes, let's let the imagination roam and have a good time with it, to be a little bit creepy or a little bit just off kilter or offbeat. And what's interesting to me is that all of Adventure Time feels like that to me. I sometimes ask my daughter, and for those who are uninitiated in Adventure Time, I'll ask my daughter, "Oh, you read this thing? Tell me about it." And she'll be able to summarize the plot and the characters, and bring up a familiar setting. And then I'm like, "Tell me about Adventure Time. What happened?" And she's like, "I don't even," because it's so. It's so not random, but it feels like such this like cobbling together of all kinds. Then there's a talking dog, and then there's this Ice King, and that's part of what's awesome about it. It's so great that it's such a mashup of stuff, and I think it prepares kids in a way kids and adults for a world in which we're so hyper diverse that you never know what you're going to encounter in the lands of our imagination. And Peppermint Butler, who is the cover character, and actually he's in 3, at least, maybe all 4. I think he's in most of these stories, is this interesting character who, from my understanding, is this very genial, very on the spot butler who's ready to help out, but there's these hints of a dark past, or maybe it's not a hint, maybe it's outright explored in a story where he is the dark one. Are
you talking about Pep?
Yeah, Pep. Yeah, Peppermint Butler. Yeah, Pep.
Yeah.
And there's a moment in one of these stories where it turns out he's like the Lord of Hell, and Jake and Finn have sold their souls to the devil, and he's lording it over them in eternal damnation. And it was so off kilter that my daughter and I had a moment of like, what? And then a laughter. And so that's to me, that's what Adventure Time is for, and that's what you get in this. So whether you're a fan or not, not. That's just what you can find there. That's interesting.
Exactly. Yeah, I really liked that turn at the end of that story, the second one, War of the Magicians. Right. Of the 4 shorts in this year's issue of Adventure Time Spooktacular, the one that I think had the least impact on me was Gumball's Masquerade. It was okay, but not as good as the other. And curiously enough, I think that's the only story where Peppermint Butler isn't a character in even in a minor way, because I don't remember seeing him. I mean, there is Butterscotch.
Right, Butler.
The butler to Princess Gumballs. And by the way, she is referred to as Gumballs.
Oh, you're right. I stand corrected.
So, yeah. And so I more appreciate the stories where Pep is a character in a major or minor way.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is fun. I mean, I'm not going to go out of my way to read many Adventure Time comics, as enjoyable as they are. But every now and again, picking up a special like the Spooktacular and like a free comic book day issue is always a treat.
Yeah,
so to speak, since we're dealing with candy here.
There you go. Not a trick, a treat.
It's monster surfing time.
Well, let's look at the next 2 titles that we have on our list, and both of these are from Dark Horse. This is Mr. Higgins Comes Home. This is written by Mike Mignola with art by Warwick Johnson-Cadwell. And then Sherlock, Frankenstein, and the Legion of Evil #1, written by Jeff Lemire with art by David Rubín. And I think that I'm much more familiar with Mr. Higgins Comes Home, and you're more familiar with Sherlock, Frankenstein, and the Legion of Evil. Correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, Sherlock, Frankenstein, and the Legion of Evil #1 came out last week, October 18th. Then Mr. Higgins Comes Home. I believe the release date is the 31st of October, so it comes out right on Halloween. Tell me your thoughts on Sherlock, Frankenstein, and the Legion of Evil, because this is a spinoff or based in the world of Black Hammer, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So essentially, Black Hammer, for those who haven't been reading it, which is a Jeff Lemire written and mostly Dean Ormston illustrated series at Dark Horse, and a fantastic series. One of those ones that if you're not necessarily a superhero fan, but not turned off by superhero stories that are interesting and doing something fun and unique, I think that's one worth checking out. There's some interesting Silver Age nostalgia in that series. And essentially what's happened in that one is that this group of Silver Age superheroes, or Golden Silver Age around then, sort of, were in a city and doing superhero things, and there was some massive event, and then from there they disappeared and disappeared into a small town that has all these mysterious, aspects to it, and they can't get out of the town. So that's the setup of Black Hammer, and the event that leads to their disappearance is alluded to in this title. And so I think you can read and enjoy Sherlock Frankenstein without having read Black Hammer, but I think it'll make you want to go back to read Black Hammer, in which case I would say go do it because it's a great series. But Ormston is the artist. Here, David Rubín, who's done a variety of work, including some of the Paul Pope series. I'm blanking on it. Help me. Do you remember the Paul Pope?
Battling Boy.
Battling Boy. Thank you. Some of the Battling Boy follow-ups, and also a bunch of other work, including the Ether series. Anyway,
Hero.
That's right.
2-volume Hero.
2-volume Hero from Dark Horse. That's right. So he's a Spanish
great
artist.
Spanish creator. Yeah.
Yeah. Who has just a phenomenally attractive style. So, and I think he did a fill-in or two of Black Hammer. Anyway, this series takes off in that same world and about that same, big event that led to the superheroes' disappearance, but centered around one of their villains, who is Sherlock Frankenstein. And so, you can imagine with a name like Sherlock Frankenstein that it's a combination of a bunch of genre allusions, that character is. But it really is actually the daughter of one of the superheroes, the Black Hammer superhero, who is our Vantage Point character, leading us into exploring more about maybe the villain side of this world of heroes that Lemire and Ormston have created. And so all that to say, I don't think it's as much of a horror title as expanding on this universe from a different vantage point, which I think it's just such an interestingly constructed universe that it's just worth checking out. And so I'm encouraging folks to read Sherlock, Frankenstein, and the Legion of Evil, and then to check out the whole if that's your way into the whole Black Hammer world that Lemire and company are creating, then that's a cool thing.
That's cool. Now, I read the first narrative arc of Black Hammer and then kind of dropped off of it, not because I didn't like it, just, there's a lot of things competing for my reading attention.
Sure.
But I do enjoy Black Hammer. We discussed the first issue on the Comics Alternative a number of months ago. In fact, we had an episode where we looked at kind of a superhero-y kind of titles without being mainstream superheroes. So I think we looked at issue number 1 and maybe 2 and 3, I think, of Black Hammer at the same time that we looked at an issue of Faith. And I think both of those are titles that, they're superhero titles, but they're particular twists on the superhero genre, which, we're particularly interested in, even though we don't talk about DC and Marvel mainstream superhero titles. I've got to check that out.
Yeah.
Now, you said that Sherlock, Frankenstein, and the Legion of Evil, this issue, is not necessarily horror-related, even though it has a Frankenstein reference. When it comes to Mr. Higgins Comes Home, again, it's going to be released on Halloween, the 31st, is definitely a horror-related title.
Yeah.
Again, this is written... Yeah, this is written by Mike Mignola, and Warwick Johnson-Cadwell does the art. I wasn't familiar with Johnson-Cadwell's art. I really enjoy it. Apparently, he's done some work on Tank Girl, and I think that his art works well alongside Mignola's storytelling. In that there's something serious about the story, but at the same time, there's kind of a weirdness about this.
Yeah.
And I think that Warwick Johnson-Cadwell's art kind of brings out that strangeness to some degree, a little dose of humor in there as well. Now, see, this is the story of two characters. There's a Professor Meinhardt, and he has an assistant named Knox, Mr. Knox. And they have come to this kind of a European location in order to, they're vampire hunters, and they've come to confront Count Gulgus and his wife, the Countess, and they want to take care of them. But in order to do that, they first go through this character named Higgins. And so they go talk with Higgins. Higgins, years ago, right after he had married, and his bride's name was Mary, their wagon broke down and they were rescued by Count Gulgus and his wife. They were invited back to their castle. They were fed. They had a place to stay. But during that stay, and when Meinhardt and his assistant go to Higgins, we get this backstory of what happened to Higgins and his wife. They ended up turning into a vampire, Higgins' wife, Mary. And then they did something to Higgins, but you don't exactly know what. So as Higgins is telling this story, he's also saying that he wants to die. Because he can't confront what he's become, but we don't know what that is. And so Higgins says that he will help Meinhardt and Knox get to Gulgus if they promise to kill him afterwards with a silver bullet. And so when he says something about a silver bullet, you kind of sense what has become of him. Gulgus, Count Gulgus, and his wife have heard that Meinhardt is in town or close to it, and so what they want to do is to make a preemptive strike. Instead of waiting for Meinhardt to come attack them and kill them, get rid of them, is Gulgus invites Meinhardt, Knox, and then Higgins to his castle for a celebration. Walpurgis, and I'm not sure how you pronounce that, but basically it's Witch's Night.
Right.
Walpurgis. Again, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. I wish I were more adept at German or Germanic languages than I am. But so anyway, Golgus invites Meinhard Higgins and Meinhard's assistant to the castle so that he would be the one in control. And then it's I guess the last half of this book, it's a relatively short book. It's roughly about 60-some pages.
Right.
It's what happens once they get to Golgus's castle. Things don't go according to Golgus's plans. Higgins, let's say other self, so to speak, shows itself. I don't want to give too much away here. And it's an interesting story. It's relatively short, and there is a somewhat humorous side to it, maybe black humor more than anything. But it definitely does function in the, I think, Halloween seasonal horror mode.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why I wanted us to, at least say a few words about Mr. Higgins Comes Home.
Yeah, and Mignola has for so many years done so much of storytelling that if it's not terrifying itself, is building upon terrors of old and mythologies of old that make us shake in our boots. So so I like this. It looks really fun. I hadn't read it, but I've been flipping through it, and I like the art. It looks really
it really
intriguing.
is good.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'll tell you something you may not understand, but I'm a thirsty vampire. I want to bite your head, shoot. I want to bite your head. I want to bite your head.
Okay, let's turn to the next two titles that we're going to be looking at. Both of them are from Archie Comics, but they're very different in tone. The first one is Jughead the Hunger, and this is written by Frank Tieri with art by Pat and Tim Kennedy. And then the second title is Archie Halloween Spectacular by a variety of different artists, although we should mention that of the three stories in Archie Halloween Spectacular, two of them include art by Pat and Tim Kennedy.
The same as The Hunger.
Exactly. Exactly. Which is curious.
Yes.
Now, in past Halloween specials that we've done on the Comics Alternative, we've been able to talk about Archie or Afterlife with Archie and the new or relatively new, I guess, Sabrina, because both of those were released, I think, around Halloween. And now we have, maybe 2 years after Sabrina, Jughead the Hunger that is being released this Wednesday as this episode goes up, October 25th. The Archie Halloween Spectacular came out this month. I'm not exactly sure when it comes out this month. I couldn't get an exact date on that, but I know that Jughead the Hunger comes out this Wednesday. Obviously, Jughead the Hunger is the more, how do I put this, more mature, more adult of the two titles. Archie Halloween Spectacular is what you would consider, let's say, typical Archie. Kind of all age. It's the kind of Archie that you would see in the digests at the grocery store checkout, which I used to read as a kid. And so it's all ages. It's safe for younger readers. Jughead the Hunger, I don't know if I would give it to a very younger reader, because there are some graphic aspects to it. What did you think of Jughead the Hunger?
I have really appreciated the whole endeavor of what Alex Segura and company have done with Archie, because so for folks who don't know, and you should definitely go listen to those episodes that talk about Afterlife with Archie and Sabrina. Basically what they've done is, there is that classic Archie that has been around for, God knows how many decades, that we were all sort of familiar with from the supermarket check stands and so forth. And I think what they wanted to do, which is also reflected in the new Archie's series and the Riverdale TV show and all that kind of stuff, is to sort of dust off these, characters where maybe familiarity has been, it's kind of trustworthy, but it's also maybe bred a little bit of contempt or dismissal, and really pushed them to some extremes, and pushed past the sort of general family entertainment fare. And so Afterlife with Archie is terrifying. And like wonderfully so. If you like horror stuff, it's good. It's good, and it's graphic, and it's got that Francesca Francavilla like lusciously pulpy art. It's bathed in the deep oranges that Francavilla has made as stock in trade. And actually, all that style is very much reflected here. As you mentioned earlier, same artists, Pat and Tim Kennedy, they also did the Death of Archie series, which was a fairly recent and a little bit more actually in the classic vein. But they've done a really good job of, not imitating the Francavilla style, but of, I think, being within it, sort of like this matches, this resonates,
Right.
And so Jughead the Hunger kind of continues the stories where it's turned out that Jughead is a werewolf, which shouldn't be a surprise. It's there on the cover. But he, in realizing that what he's done to Riverdale, is fleeing. And then Betty Cooper, who turns out to be a werewolf hunter, with
coming from a family of werewolf hunters.
That's right, no less right. Who we actually encounter parts of that family, has dragged Archie along in the werewolf hunt for Jughead in this story, and then we find out more about other familiar Riverdale characters and how they enter the picture here. As you said, it's very mature. It's quite graphic. The one image in particular, I won't soon get out of my head. And just like the previous series, and I don't think Frank Tieri, I think this is the first that Frank Tieri is writing in this world. Am I right about that?
I'm not sure.
Okay. But continues to do a good job. I mean, this is just really good horror storytelling where even I, as not a fan of this genre, have been really intrigued to read like the Sabrina stuff because it's just too good not to. So I think it continues. To me, this issue of Jughead the Hunger #1 was really effective.
Yeah. Several things that you mentioned and I want to follow up on. You're right. In the past several years, we have had interesting turns when it comes to Archie, the property.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't read past the first narrative arc of Mark Waid's Archie, but that Archie, even though it's not horrific like Afterlife, Jughead the Hunger, and Sabrina, it is a different, more contemporary take on Archie.
Yeah.
I do think that it's primarily all age. It's a little more mature than, let's say, the classic Archie, the more cartoony Archie. But I think it's still accessible to a variety of readers of different ages, even though it's taken Archie in a more contemporary direction. But when it comes to the horror stuff, like Afterlife with Archie, Sabrina, and now we have Jughead the Hunger, not for all ages. Another thing that you mentioned is, we have Jughead, who is a werewolf. If you open this issue with the credits page and the copyright page, all that information, you get previously. It says, a vicious killer was ravaging the quiet streets of Riverdale, leaving his victims not only dead, but maimed and beheaded. And so we get the background, Jughead is, this werewolf, and Betty is hunting him because she is from a long line of werewolf hunters. She's got Archie with him, and Jughead has left Riverdale because he apparently has killed Reggie Mantle. Okay. I know I saw that there was a 0 issue on Comixology of Jughead the Hunger. Was this previous Jughead the Hunger story elsewhere? And I can't remember, was it in a Free Comic Book Day title? Was it where was this previous story, this setup?
Right.
Because I was unfamiliar with it.
No, that's a good question. I actually am trying to remember myself where I say remember as I type into the Google. But I do remember that there was a Jughead the Hunger 0. Whether it came out as Free Comic Book Day or what, I'm not recalling. But it was a while back. Let's see if I can find it. But no, it did set up the story, and I think it did set up specifically the the situation where Jughead is fleeing, trying to run away from himself, which is a lot of what this story is about, which is an intriguing thing. And then the Betty in pursuit setup. But no, I don't remember where it came from.
Now, I just looked on mycomicshop.com, which is a great place not only to get comics, but also, to find out information about when things came out. And I guess this initial one-shot was released. Okay, it says published May. So I don't know if it was a Free Comic Book Day title, but it was a one-shot that came out around the time of Free Comic Book Day, if indeed it did come out in May.
Got it.
So there's the initial setup. I didn't read that, so this was all new to me.
Yeah.
But I don't think you had to read that zero issue or the one-shot in order to appreciate or understand what's going on in issue number 1 of Jughead the Hunger.
Yeah, agree.
That, is just coming out this week. Because that previously set up that I referred to is enough.
Right.
And so you can get right into this. And where Jughead is now, I mean, he's run away from Riverdale and he's joined a circus, kind of a small circus. And he is talking at some point with someone who's been with the circus for a while, someone named Abby. And she basically tells him that she doesn't know exactly what he's done to run away and to become a part of this circus, but she tells him about everybody here is running away from something. And so she introduces him to different people and what they're running away from. Sometimes what they're running away from is rather nefarious. Other times it's not so bad, but they're wanting to escape something from their past. And so Jughead is made to believe that, he's no different than the other people who are working with this circus. And this may be a place that even though he would rather be back in Riverdale, he could potentially fit in. Now, we do see him toward the last part of this first issue chain himself up. And in fact, he uses the chains of a magician whose shtick is to chain himself up, and then he's an escape artist. He'll get out. So Jughead has stolen these chains in order to chain himself up because he knows he'll turn into a werewolf. And he chains himself up, but then he finds himself the next morning out of the chains and wonders, how did I get out? Did someone unchain me? He also finds someone, and I don't want to give it away, dead. And he begins to panic. And then this issue ends with Jughead, and I don't think this is a spoiler, as a werewolf confronting Veronica, who is wondering where Betty and Archie are. So I think that this is a good, solid first issue. It sets up the story of Jughead as a werewolf. It leaves literally on a cliff. Well, not literally on a cliffhanger, so we don't have a cliff. But it leaves on it ends on a cliffhanger. And so I think Tieri's story is well constructed. And then Pat and Tim Kennedy's art, you're right. It does have, to a large degree, that Franco Villa feel to it. But to me, what's so amazing is that Pat and Tim Kennedy's art in Jughead the Hunger is vastly different from Pat and Tim Kennedy's art in two stories from Archie Halloween Spectacular.
Right.
If you didn't know they were the same artist, you wouldn't think
Sure.
by looking at the art that the people who did Jughead the Hunger also did two of the stories in Archie Halloween Spectacular from this year.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, to go back to something you were saying, I think that well, you're right. We don't want to spoil anything. I do think that the ending, the werewolf at the end, is maybe a little different from what you said, but it's probably better that we don't go into the detail, but better that folks will be surprised by whatever that is at the end. But yeah, about the art, absolutely. You're sort of like, oh, are these the same folks? It does remind me that I think, there's an interesting thing that Pat and Tim Kennedy get to do is to show off, hey, I can do canonical Archie. Like I can do, the Archie in the mainstream, and also I can do Archie. We can do Archie in this very different note, and I think that's kind of fun. I like that artists get when artists get a chance to work in this, follow the model sheets, as they say in animation, and draw according to the style and form, and then get to break out of that and really do something pretty different. And so you're right. There's it's kind of cool to see them do this. Jughead the Hunger art, and then to know that they're the same folks that are doing classic Archie as well.
Right. Yeah. Now, in terms of this classic Archie issue, I don't have much to say about Archie Halloween Spectacular that came out or is coming out this month. But, the three stories are Scary, Scary Do, Giving Up the Ghost, and A Party for Ghosts. And in terms of Scary, Scary Do, this is written by Alex Simmons with art by Pat and Tim Kennedy. Giving Up the Ghost by Paul Kupperberg and art by Pat and Tim Kennedy. And then Dexter Taylor does, I think, both the story and the art of A Party for Ghosts. And the thing about A Party for Ghosts is it's this third story. It's the one in this issue, Archie Halloween Spectacular, where you have Little Betty, Little Veronica, Little Archie, Little Reggie, Little, Jughead. And, it's classic Archie. A Party for Ghost is, I guess, the quote-unquote cutest of the three. But Scary, Scary Do and Giving Up the Ghost are, the kind of Archie that you would think of as Archie. Again, I don't have much to say about them. They're kind of fun. There's not a lot going on with them. It's the kind of Archie that I think younger readers have been gravitating toward and reading for decades. And it's a good enough read, I think. If you like the classic Archie. I tend to like the more mature, edgy stuff. So, Of course, I'm going to prefer Jughead the Hunger. But Archie Halloween Spectacular is not bad either.
Yeah. Reading these two in juxtaposition just made me think, how much of the effectiveness of the new Archie stuff, including the horror and the a little more of a departure, but even as you were saying, the Mark Waid and initially it was Fiona Staples and then Annie Wu and a bunch of other artists who bring a more much more hip and contemporary look to Archie. I wonder how much, and even the Riverdale TV show, like, would all of that have half as much resonance or meaning if not for this classic Archie still hanging around? Like if we still didn't have the old Archie around, would young people be able to pick up on how sort of like sneakily subversive it is to do these like crazy, horrific things with, this edgy Archie? It's kind of a fun thought experiment. I mean, these three stories are pretty standard, whatever Archie classic bourgeois values, showing up in kids comics form. But I feel like that always has to be on newsstands, because if you don't have that, then the sort of little rebellious departures that these other stories don't have quite as much punch. So that's
a good point.
Thought.
Yeah, it is. And I could see people who really like, let's say, Mark Waid's Archie or these horror titles based on, the Archie property, thinking, well, let's get rid of the classic Archie, the kind of all-age, rounded, iconic Archie. But, if you do that, then these other more mature titles, if we want to call them that,
right.
I think they lose some of their significance by comparison, right? Because there's nothing to compare it to.
Right.
So you can't, you can't have dark without the light. You can't have white without the black. And understand that. So you can't have the more mature Archie in the way that we're appreciating that without the more innocent, all-age stuff that, with a lot of older readers, they may not like. But again, there's nothing wrong with that more innocent classic Archie. I like it. I don't read it on a regular basis, but I don't make it a point of pushing it away anytime it's near me. I'll check it out.
Yeah. And in this case, we have. So if that's what you're looking for, then Archie Halloween Spectacular is for you.
Hello there, all you living.
Junior, did you bite Mommy on the neck? Good night.
Here, boy, here, boy.
I wouldn't eat you, 'cause you're too...
Okay, now we come to an interesting title, DC House of Horror. Now, it's not often that we discuss a straight-down-the-line DC titles. If we discuss DC more times than not, it's going to be Vertigo. I mean, we've discussed some DC, not being Vertigo in the past, but it's not that often. And that's because the vast majority of DC comics are superhero based in the DC universe, and given the nature of the comics alternative, it's not that we don't like that stuff. We do appreciate it. It's just that, about every other comics podcast out there discusses mainstream superhero, Marvel and DC, so we're doing something different. Now, I guess you could say that this is a superhero title, a DC superhero title, but it's one with a twist. Basically, you have the main players in the DC universe, Superman, Batman, Green Arrow, Wonder Woman, Joker, Harley Quinn, so on and so forth, Green Lantern, as characters, but they're horror stories, they're horror scenarios.
Right.
And we have, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 stories. Now, this is about an 80-page comic, and it clocks in at, price-wise, $9.99, which sounds like a lot for a comic book, but again, this is 80 pages. So, I'll leave it to our listeners to determine if it's worth the price or not. We got our copy digitally for free, so we didn't have to pay the $9.99. I think if I had to pay the $9.99, I would feel a little stronger about the price.
Sure.
But this, it's a number of stories that are very different. Now, the first story, Bump in the Night, is a Superman story. The second one, Man's World, is a Wonder Woman story. Crazy for You, the third, is a Harley Quinn story. The fourth, Last Laugh, Batman. Blackest Day, you'd think, well, it's a Green Lantern. Actually, it's a Justice League story. Stray Arrow, as you might expect, Green Arrow. Unmasked is a Two-Face story. And in fact, that's one of just 2 stories in this collection, this anthology, that's based on villains. The other one is the Harley Quinn, Crazy for You. And then the final one, which is actually one of my favorites, is a Shazam story, The Possession of Billy Batson. And one of the reasons why it's my favorite, or one of my favorites, is that the artist is Howard Chaykin. But, we have 8 stories here in this DC horror superhero anthology. And maybe one way to begin discussing this is by me asking you which stories, not necessarily you like the most, although you can tell me that, but which ones seem to stand out to you the most? If any.
I guess I would add that was a great setup and explanation. I'm sure some people reading or hearing that are like, "Oh man, this is totally my jam," and some people are like, maybe I'm out." But I guess I would also add that it seems like all the stories were plotted by Keith Giffen, good old Keith Giffen, but they're all written by horror writers. I think they're contemporary horror novelists, and so it's also an interesting artifact of people who don't usually write comics. And I don't know that they all don't ever write comics, but they're, I think, generally known in the horror genre writers. People like Edward Lee, Mary San Giovanni, Brian Smith and Brian Keene, Nick Cutter. I'm naming these folks. I actually don't know any of them because, as I said, I don't read much in the genre to begin with. But yeah, horror writers applying their talents to DC heroes. And I think the other thing that's interesting, and this will lead into which one stood out to me, is that the part of the notion is if you took the origin stories of most of our classic superheroes, particularly like DC heroes, and you just put different background music to them, they could actually sound like horrific stories. Alien lands in a farm town backyard, and this oldish couple goes out to see what's landed, and then baby jumps out, which is kind of the setup for Bump in the Night. What if that wasn't a Truth, Justice, and the American Way? Clark Kent that came out, but a diabolical alien monster. And so it's sort of spinning all of these DC heroes origin stories as a horror story, which is kind of interesting. And from that point of view, I thought I see what they're doing, and that becomes interesting. And so the most interesting ones to me were the ones who did something where I didn't think of their origin story that way because I'm so steeped in Wonder Woman's background, being Wonder Woman or so on, that it surprised me. And so from that vantage point, one I did not like because it seemed to just kind of revel in the horrificness that was already there was the Two-Face one. But I agreed with you. The last possession of Billy Batson was a great sort of, this notion of this sort of kid being given the power of the gods, which is, of course, Captain Marvel, Shazam's background story. Could be
the real Captain Marvel, not the Marvel.
Right. The original Captain
Marvel. The big
Marvel.
cheese.
That's right, the big cheese. CC Beck. Shout out to CC Beck. But yeah, that story as a possession story and the way that it's written and set up is just is so much fun. And I'd say the same about the Wonder Woman story, which was the one by Mary Sangiovanni with art by Bilquis Evely, who has been one of the artists on the main Wonder Woman title, who's an artist I really enjoy. So those were the ones that stood out to me, I think. The ones I liked the most were that creepy turn was like, oh, that totally works.
Yeah, you did reference one or two artists, but you were primarily talking about the writers who, I guess, if Keith Giffen plotted them out, you had as writers fairly well known within the genre horror writers. Now, like you, I'm not familiar with these writers. To me, it's the art that really stood out in this anthology. I think all the art really of in all the stories I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
I think that this was an interesting take on the superhero genre. And taking these characters and giving them a seasonal Halloween-y horror spin. I think that as a whole, though, I have to say that this project, the various stories, are half-baked. Now, let me contextualize what I mean by the word half-baked. Now, most people think of the term half-baked in kind of a pejorative, negative way, that, it's kind of wacky, it's not really thought through very well. To some degree, maybe that's what I mean by that. But what I mean by half-baked is that the premise of about every one of these stories is pretty good. I like it. But I don't know if by the end, with most of these, not all of them, but all these stories, by the time I got to the end of them, I was wanting something else. In other words, I felt that there was more that could be done. Again, I'm not wanting a longer novelistic, graphic novel, whatever you want to call it, story going on here. It's just that by the time I got to the end of, let's say, Bump in the Night or Crazy for You or Stray Arrow, I thought, that's it? And it just didn't seem complete to me. Now, there were a couple of stories that resonated a little better. One I've already mentioned, The Possession of Billy Batson. I thought that ended in a very clever way. And Last Laugh, I did think that, that was by writer Nick Cutter with Rags Morales doing the art. I did like that story. Unmasked, which is the Two-Face story, to a point. But the rest of them, I thought, when I finished them, there should be more. And so that's what I mean by half-baked. Not it's wacky and crazy or stupid. It's just that there was more. Had it stayed in the ovens, metaphorically speaking, longer, I think I would have appreciated them more.
Yeah. And yeah, it's hard to know how much of that is just the constraints that they were given or, Keith Giffen's plotting or the writer's writing and all that stuff. Yeah.
But it is interesting, and I do like the fact that DC has taken its main players from the DC universe and put them in a horror setting that is, of course, outside of the DC universe, the stories that go on there. Yeah. I do appreciate that. And you're right, there are constraints here. Yes, it's an 80-page comic, but we have 8 short pieces in this anthology, so there's only so much that they can do. So I guess I shouldn't ask for too much, but it's an interesting exercise. I don't read DC mainstream titles like I used to. I've kind of lost track of what's going on in the DC universe. I just hear about it by listening to other comics podcasts. But it does have me to some degree wanting to get back into the DC universe and play catch up.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if anybody who is in those same shoes would be curious about the latest Batman event that Scott Snyder's up to, because there is a little bit of dark versions of Batman going on in that one. But I think some of the artists here are heavily represented in DC Comics these days, and others not so much, like used to be in the past. I imagine that these artists were licking their chops, like, the chance to do this kind of fun, little horror departure. But the Kyle Baker art on the Harley Quinn story is awesome. Anytime I get to see Kyle Baker do stuff, I'm on board. Yeah. So
yeah, a standout artist, one of my favorites as well.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look now at two IDW titles. One came out October 3rd, and that is Spooky, The Strange Tales, Monster Inn. And then another one, Behind You, comes out on October 31st, appropriately enough.
Behind me right now? Or? I'm just kidding. We'll come to that.
Yes, we'll come to that. Now, Behind You, which we'll get to in a moment, is by Brian Coldrick. And Spooky, The Strange Tales, Monster Inn is by, and I hope I'm pronouncing these names correctly, and I think they're French, Elaine Blackmore and Carine-M. And in fact, Spooky, The Strange Tales, Monster Inn is this volume's title, because I got the sense that Spooky, The Strange Tales is a series that Blackmore and Carine-M do. Right. And it says that Ivanka Hannenberger and Donald Kersey are not only the translators, but also those who did the adaptation. So translator, okay. I'm curious, though, about the adaptation. I mean, I guess I should have looked this up a little more, but what is it about Spooky, The Strange Tales, this series, that needs an adaptation? Does it appear in a different medium?
No, that's a great question. I'm not certain, although I can imagine that. So, and this goes into what the book is a little bit, but the book is, it's definitely for younger audiences, and it's a notebook. It's a notebook sort of that includes art and quite a lot of text, actually, that describes, sort of retells a bunch of fairy tale like stories, but with a sort of spooky, slightly scary twist. Not really super scary, but there's
scary cute.
Scary cute, exactly. That's perfect. And it is a scary cute book, and it is a scary cute journal. But since it is such a diary sort of format, I wonder if a lot of the adaptation, because you can't just do a straight linguistic translation. I think there's a lot that goes on with fonts and stylized text and stuff like that. That I wonder if that's part of the adaptation, where rather than just entering into a word processor, the phrase by phrase translation, you also had to do some things with formatting and stuff like that to achieve the same thing that's going on here.
Yeah, so that may be where the adaptation part is coming in. Now, the way that you were describing Spooky, The Strange Tales, Monster Inn, it's not in, let's say, a traditional comic book or graphic novel, whatever you want to call it, format. In other words, you don't have panels, multiple panels within over most of the pages that tell a story sequentially. Right. This is like a notebook that's used as a diary, and what we're reading supposedly is Spooky, the main character. She's a young girl. Her diary entries is basically how the story unfolds. And one of the reasons why it's interesting to look at these two IDW titles, Spooky, The Strange Tales, Monster Inn, and then Coldrick's Behind You, is that both of them are unconventional comics. Right. Spooky is in this diary format. It's not sequential in terms of panels telling a story. And the same thing can be said of Behind You, which it's not in diary or journal form, but basically every page is just a single panel. And we'll get to what Behind You is about in a moment. But I think both of these IDW titles, coming out in October for the Halloween season, are interesting in that, if for no other reason, their departure from the typical comic book.
Yeah. I would say that Spooky, Strange Tales is like a kid version of Emil Ferris's monster. What is it? Help me,
My favorite thing
is monsters, right?
Yes.
In the sense of being an elaborately decorated artistic journal with plenty of text and also the placement of art being interesting. Yeah.
That's a good point. I did not think of Spooky the Strange Tales Monster Inn within the context of Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters. But you're right. It is kind of a kid's version of that. It does some of the similar things.
Sure.
Although I do have to say that Spooky the Strange Tales Monster Inn at times got a little confusing to me because there's so much going on. Because this, again, as we pointed out, it's like a journal that a young girl has written in. And so there are things all over the place, right? And they're not necessarily connected in a coherent way. I mean, they aren't, but they aren't. And so as a reader, it's up to us to kind of, connect the dots, so to speak, and to make sense of the things that are on the page.
Yeah.
And at times it does get a little confusing. So, from what I can gather, the premise of the story is that the main character, Spooky, is visited by three of her uncles, which are the three little pigs, and that her diary was at one point going to be a book of fairy tales. There is this fairy tale sense of this book, and we find that primarily in the Three Little Pigs. But her uncles, the Three Little Pigs, are a little hipper. They run an inn, thus the title Monster Inn, and then a series of mysteries occur at the inn. So, for instance, the jam is eaten. Who ate the jam? And so that's a mystery that propels much of the story. There's a mystery surrounding one of the people who is visiting and staying at the inn, Little Red Riding Hood, another fairy tale reference. And so that propels much of the story, especially toward the last half. So, I mean, it's interesting. It's just as I was reading this, there seemed to be a lot of balls that were being juggled at particular times.
Yeah.
And so putting that all together, I think, as a reader, as a mature reader, was a bit of a challenge. But I can see where a kid, a younger reader, could really get a lot out of this.
Yeah. And, I always feel the same thing about this kind of text. I mean, that kind of hard to piece it all together is actually characteristic of something like Emil Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters, but it also is characteristic of actually more and more of the things that I find kids reading these days. They're reading, this is a very simple version, but like Diary of a Wimpy Kid is like hugely popular.
Yeah,
but, the narrative is not so straightforward. It is a lot of piecing things together from almost artifact pieces, that are fabricated. But kids are often smarter than we think they are. And so they can kind of put these things together. And a lot of the draw, too, is the way that things are designed, decorated. There's almost a Scotty Young-like quality to the art that's
there is, that's
really
a good
fun.
comparison.
So, yeah. So I think a kid could be really, really into this. I feel the same way that you did. Sometimes I'm a little mystified, but and then I feel it's probably because I'm an old dude.
Now, something that's probably a little more our speed is this other IDW title that's, again, going to be released on the 31st of October, and this is Brian Coldrick's Behind You. Now, were you familiar with Coldrick and or Behind You before this book?
No, I was not. Although I read a little bit of the prehistory. Joe Hill, who writes the introduction, I think he's the.
It's a good introduction.
Yeah, it's a good
Lock
one.
and Key,
worth reading. Yeah, Lock and Key guy. So that was nice to get me up to speed a little bit on it.
Yeah, and basically what you have with Behind You is a series of one panel, or I guess one page, illustrations,
right.
And in every one, there is someone or something, some presence behind someone or haunting someone or out of the range of vision of someone. And as Joe Hill points out, one of the great things about the various, I don't know if we want to call them comics, the single panels in Behind You, is that it's a moment frozen in time, and part of the joy of reading that panel is imagining
what has happened before that moment that you're viewing, and then what could possibly happen after that. So basically, you're filling in the before and after of this moment that is represented in the panel. And in every single one of these panels, you have someone in some kind of scenario or situation with some kind of presence of various sorts out of their range of vision, basically behind them. Thus the title, Behind You.
Right.
And I didn't know until I read Joe Hill's introduction that Coldrick actually does have a Tumblr page where this book actually originated. So if you go to the hairs on the back of your neck.tumblr.com, and that's one word, the hairs, plural, on the back of your neck.tumblr.com, I think you could get, in essence, what is in this book. I mean, we're not telling you not to buy this book, but you can see it on Coldrick's Tumblr page. And the earliest stories are the earliest ones in this book. And so I think what Coldrick has done, I haven't gone through all of this Tumblr page, but I've gone through a number of the entries. And yeah, they're the same thing that you see in this book. I think that this, it's about 180, 170 some pages. But it's a relatively quick read because, in essence, you have the book. If you open it up, on the right side page, you have the panel. On the left side of the spread, you have the text. So, for instance, the text basically supplements, or at least gives you a way to begin reading what is in the image. So I'm looking at one example. The text is, "The mirror was already here when we moved in." And the image is of this, what looks like a teenage girl who is standing in front of a mirror but turning away, and an image that looks like her in the mirror that she can't see is reaching out at her. And, it, as well as every other illustration in this book, is pretty damn creepy.
Yeah.
And so the text gives a way of setting up what's in the visuals. Another example is, there's an image of an older or middle-aged man who's sitting in a chair, and he has a book in his lap, and then behind him is this giant figure. I don't even know what the heck this is. And the text that goes with it is, "The book had described himself, his room, his chair, and it."
Right. Yeah.
Again, creepy as hell.
Yes.
And so this is the kind of thing that you see in Coldrick's various illustrations, and in the one sentence, maybe sometimes two sentence descriptors that accompany each panel.
Yep.
And you have the same thing on that website. Again, the hairs on the back of your neck.com, .tumblr.com. But I think the text is underneath the illustration. Here in the book, it's on the facing page. And it is an interesting exercise in, I guess, reader participation. Because, again, you're just given a frozen moment where someone has something behind them or out of their field of vision. It's creepy, but you don't know what led up to that moment and what happens after that moment.
That's right. Yeah, that's a great description. The art is, like you said, creepy. Some of these images I will never be able to unsee. Thanks, Derek. And one, for example, says, and actually the how spare and poetic the prose is of that one sentence can often be part of the quality that works so well. There's one that says, "This had been her room." And there's a guy sleeping in his bed, and there is a very scary dark, ghostly figure coming out from under the bed.
That freaked me out.
That was no good. Actually, it was very good. And we should say Coldrick's art is really cool to look at, really beautiful, and it's scary in an interesting way because actually, without the ghost, the actual cartooned figures are not that scary. They're actually kind of they could be even cute. They could be from an animated film. But with the scary elements, they get really under your skin, which is exactly the desired effect. And actually, I'm glad you brought up the Tumblr site, because Joe Hill talks about this too. In a lot of the the originals that are on the Tumblr site, and it's worth checking out there. They actually are animated images.
That's right. Yeah.
And so some of these, if you go to the site, it's the animation. It's often a very subtle animation, something shifting in the background. But as you can imagine from the premise, that's really all you need for it. It should be only subtle, something shifting in the background that utterly makes your skin crawl. So, job well done to Brian Coldrick in planting things in our nightmares. But it is also just kind of a fun collection of these little ways of one particular way of things being super creepy to you. And now I'm scared to turn around where I'm sitting.
Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned the animation on the Tumblr site. I should have mentioned that earlier when I mentioned the Tumblr URL, because that reminded me somewhat of what Emily Carroll does with her webcomics, because, her webcomics are creepy as hell as well. Yeah. And part of the creepiness is, I think, comes from the spare animation that occurs.
Right.
And, I say spare animation because when it's used sparingly, I think it's much more effective than if there's a lot of animation going on with about, every panel or every other page. But yeah, you have the same thing going on with Coldrick. It's subtle animation, but it's the subtleness that makes it so creepy. But I do think that even though the printed text, or for us the PDF, is not animated, nonetheless it's creepy. So it retains its creepiness.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So yeah, if that stuff, if our aforementioned description appeals to you, I think behind you is it's also kind of a fun gift, I think, for somebody who likes this kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That brings us to the very last title that we're going to be discussing on this year's Halloween/horror show, and that is High Moon, Bullet Holes, and Bite Marks. And this is written by David Gallaher with art by Steve Ellis. This is coming out on October 31st from Super Genius, and I'm not familiar with that publisher, as I mentioned earlier. Now, the thing about High Moon is that, and I wasn't aware of this until I started to do a little digging around, even though the book is coming out, the hard copy book is coming out next week, High Moon actually has been around since 2004, or it was developed in 2004, but in 2007, it was part of, remember DC's Zuda?
Yeah.
Their webcomic efforts that didn't last for that long. Well, this is part of Zuda, at least beginning in 2007. And so this has been around for a while, and I think that there are various storylines. So I guess what's coming out now, Bullet Holes and Bite Marks, is, I would guess, the first printing of a story arc. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there have been other hard copy printings of the High Moon series, but it's the first one that I'm seeing.
Got it. I just realized as you were talking where I'd heard of Super Genius before, and it was that they're the publishers of Trish Trash, Roller Girl of Mars, the Jessica Abel. Now, I think 2 volumes. Yeah, the second volume I got a couple of months ago. But that's Jessica Abel's all ages series about the sort of roller derby, sci-fi roller derby characters that have been coming out. And I think they're a division of Paper Cuts, which is maybe more familiar.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So
okay,
a pretty new thing, I think.
Yeah. Also, I take back what I just said, because I just looked up on Amazon, and there was a print version of High Moon Volume 1 back in 2009.
Okay.
So not too long after it debuted on Zuda.
Right.
But not much since then, I guess. Again, this is coming out October 31st. There is another volume, Wicked Ways, that is going to be released, according to Amazon, in May of next year. So if you pick up High Moon Volume 1, Bullet Holes and Bite Marks, and maybe that's what was originally published in 2009, then you can get the second volume coming out in spring of next year. Now, High Moon, I have to tell you, I was a little confused by what was going on in High Moon. Did you get a chance to take a look at this?
Only to glance at it. No, I didn't get to fully read it.
Yeah, and I think that Steve Ellis's art is quite striking, and it does get to the horror werewolfy feel that this book is all about, that this series is all about. This first volume, Bullet Holes and Bite Marks, is in 2 parts. And I think one of the things that confused me is by the time I get to the end of the first part, the first story, and they're not disconnected, but they are 2 kind of distinct stories. By the time I got to the end of the first one, I was confused as to whom I should follow as a main protagonist, because in the first half of this book, Bullet Holes and Bite Marks, at least I thought the main character was the stranger werewolf who comes into town by the name of Matthew McGregor, who's also a werewolf hunter, but he himself, I think, is suffering from, if suffer's the right word, lycanthropy. And
a lot of lycanthropy today.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But by the time I get to the end of this story, without giving anything away, there's another character that Matthew McGregor comes after named Eddie Conroy. Conroy seems to be the one who comes out on top at the end of the first story. And then going into the second half of the book, Conroy is the protagonist. Again, he seems to assume the role that Matthew McGregor had at the very beginning of the first story of this Volume 1, High Moon, Bullet Holes, and Bite Marks. And in this second story, we even get a twist of science with references to Nikola Tesla, where one of his agents, who seems to be part human, part machine, is quite prominent. But I wasn't exactly sure what role Conroy was playing in the first story and how it compared or contrasted to what's going on in the second story. And I have to tell you that after I got through this first half of High Moon, Bullet Holes, and Bite Marks, into the second, it seemed to confuse me. I decided, okay, just go ahead and quit trying to figure out the minute details. Just read it through to see if the essence of what's going on kind of sinks in. I think to some degree it did, but at the same time I was a little confused, and so I don't think that that's a function of the art. Maybe more in terms of Gallaher's writing. But again, it's interesting. I don't want to downplay Gallaher's writing here. It's just that when I read through this, I was a little confused. But, it is a horrific story. I think it does fit in well with the Halloween horror theme that we have for this week. So I did want us to discuss High Moon, Bullet Holes, and Bite Marks.
Can I ask you, and this is just from glancing at it, High Moon is allusion to High Noon, the Gary Cooper classic Western? Because there's the Western setup and tropes in addition to the werewolf.
I would guess that would have to be in both Gallaher and Ellis's mind when they were coming up with a title. The fact that it is Western based and High Noon, High Moon, it just makes sense.
Okay, yeah, I was wondered about that and to what extent it was like, it was playing with that movie, which is I haven't seen it in a very long time, but I remember really liking it. So that would make me interested in reading this further.
Yeah. So if you didn't check out High Moon when it was originally a webcomic on DC's Zuda, or if you didn't get the first volume back in 2009, that you can definitely pick it up next week on October 31st from Super Genius.
Yep.
Horrible, wasn't it?
Well, Paul, we had a full episode. I mean, we've looked at quite a number of titles. We started off with Volume 1 of Humanoids Halloween Tales.
part of the Humanoids Kids series. After that, we looked at this year's Adventure Time Spooktacular, and that's with 3 O's, not just 2, but 3.
That's right.
Then we looked at a couple of Dark Horse titles that were horror-based, not specifically Halloween, but I think the timing was appropriate. Mr. Higgins Comes Home, and then Sherlock, Frankenstein, and the Legion of Evil. And then we looked at 2 Archie comics, Jughead the Hunger, and the more classic Archie Halloween Spectacular. And then the curious anthology, DC House of Horror. Again, if you can get past the $9.99 price point, it is about 80 pages, so you do get quite a bit for that. Then we looked at a couple of unconventional comics from IDW, Spooky the Strange Tales, Monster Inn, and then Brian Coldrick's Behind You, again, creepy as hell. And then we wrapped up with a brief discussion of Gallaher and Ellis's High Moon, Bullet Holes, and Bite Marks.
It was
full
fun
episode.
Yeah. We went through a lot of books, but lots of treats and some tricks. Good time.
And no egging.
No egging. Thankfully.
Or TPing.
No toilet paper wrapped around my front yard, as far as I know.
That's right. Yes. If you want to find great titles like this, then you should check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. Every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Those specials could be in bundles, as Paul pointed out at the top of the show, or it could be individual titles, comic books, graphic novels, or what have you. So check them out, dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us. And, let us know what you thought about this year's Halloween episode. Because we enjoy doing this. We'd like to hear what you think of them. And the titles that we looked at for this year. In fact, there were a lot of titles that we could have discussed, but we just didn't have time for. So if we missed something that you thought was particularly interesting and we missed out on, let us know. And you can let us know by going to comicsalternative.com. There you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe, or you can call us the old-fashioned way. Just pick up that phone and dial 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Yeah, do let us know. We would love to hear from you because I think, as I said at the beginning, it's so intriguing, the reasons why people do and maybe don't love horror comics and the celebration of Halloween. We've touched on a variety of things. So anyway, yes, love to hear from you about this and all our episodes. You can email us at 2guys@comicsalternative.com. That's TWOGUYS. Derek is Derek at comicsalternative.com, and I'm Paul at comicsalternative.com. Would love to hear from you.
That's right. You can also find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. So a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us. And again, we do like to hear from you.
That's right.
So until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul. Let's keep reading.
That's right. Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.